Have you ever just looked up at the night sky and wondered, why? Why is any of this even here? It's probably the biggest question we can ask, right? It gets right to the heart of, well, everything.
I mean, seriously, why is there a universe at all? Why all this stuff instead of just nothing, an empty void? And look, this isn't a new question. Philosophers from Plato and Aristotle, all the way to thinkers today, have been wrestling with this exact mystery for centuries. So today, let's dive into one of the most famous attempts to answer it. We're going to break down an argument that tries to tackle this question using pure logic and science. It's called the Kalam cosmological argument. And honestly, it's a fascinating piece of reasoning, no matter what your personal beliefs are. Now, the cool thing about this argument is just how simple it is. The whole thing is built on a really straightforward three-step logical framework. We're going to walk through it piece by piece. And there it is. That's the whole argument, right there, in a nutshell. Two statements, or premises, and one conclusion that just logically follows. This is basically our roadmap. The idea is, if you can agree that step 1 and step 2 are true, then step 3 is kinda unavoidable. So let's see if they hold up.
All right, let's start with that first one. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. I mean, on the surface, this feels like common sense, right? It lines up with literally everything we see. Things don't just pop into existence. But there's a really crucial detail in how this is worded. This is a super important distinction, so let's be clear. The argument is not saying everything that exists has a cause. Because if it did, you could ask, well, what caused that cause? And you'd get stuck in this endless, infinite chain of causes going back forever. No. It's making a much more specific claim. It only applies to things that begin to exist. It's all about a starting point.
So the intuition behind it is really this. We just don't see things materializing out of thin air with no reason, no cause, right? You don't see a planet suddenly appear next to Earth or a star just pop into being. That would violate everything we know about how the universe works. So premise 1 is really grounded in that basic observation. Okay, so premise 1 seems pretty solid, at least based on our experience. So let's move on to premise 2. The universe began to exist. Now, to back this one up, the argument pulls from two different fields. We've got evidence from both science and philosophy.
From the world of science, we've got some heavy hitters. First, there's the fact that the universe is expanding. The astronomer Edwin Hubble figured out that all the galaxies are flying away from each other. So if you hit rewind on that cosmic movie, everything comes rushing back together to a single, super hot, super dense point. Then there's the cosmic microwave background radiation. Think of it as the leftover heat, the afterglow from that initial explosion, which we can still detect everywhere in space.
And then you've got this big one, the second law of thermodynamics. It basically says that everything in a closed system, like our universe, tends to go from order to disorder. You know, you spill a cup of water, it spreads out. It never spontaneously gathers itself back into the cup. Well, the universe is kind of like that. If it had been around forever, for an infinite amount of time, it would have run out of usable energy by now. It would have reached a state of maximum disorder, what scientists call heat death. The fact that we still have stars burning and galaxies forming tells us the universe hasn't reached that point yet, which means it can't be infinitely old. It must have had a beginning.
But okay, beyond the science, there's also a purely philosophical argument against an eternal past. And yeah, this one's a bit of a brain bender, but it has to do with the very idea of infinity. Okay, here's the puzzle. Think about it. You can't have an actual infinite number of things in reality. Imagine you had to count to infinity before you could start watching this. You'd never get here, right? Because you can't finish counting an infinite set of numbers. The argument applies that same logic to time. If the past was literally infinite, then an infinite number of days would have had to pass to get to today. And since you can't complete an infinite series, we could have never arrived at this present moment. So the past must be finite. So let's put it all together. If we accept premise 1, that anything that begins to exist has a cause, and we accept premise 2, that the universe, based on science and philosophy, did in fact have a beginning, then the conclusion just kind of falls into place. It becomes logically necessary. You add them up and you get the conclusion, the universe has a cause. It couldn't have just come from nothing, and it couldn't have caused itself. I mean, for something to cause itself, it would have to exist before it existed, which is just a logical contradiction. It doesn't make any sense. But this is where it gets really interesting. The argument doesn't just stop there. It says, okay, if we've established that the universe has a cause, can we figure anything out about that cause?
What would it have to be like? Well, let's break it down logically. This cause would have to be immaterial or outside of space because it created space and matter. It would have to be atemporal or timeless because it created time itself. It would have to be enormously powerful. Obviously, it created the entire universe. And finally, the argument says this cause must be personal. Why? Well, because a timeless, unchanging cause can't just suddenly decide to create something. The only way to get from a timeless state of no universe to a state of universe is through a free-willed choice. And making a choice, that's the kind of thing a person or a mind does. So let's look at our list. We have a cause that is immaterial, timeless, personal, and unimaginably powerful. What does that sound like? This is where the argument makes its final connection. When you lay out all of these attributes that seem to be logically necessary for the first cause of the universe, well, the argument concludes that they look an awful lot like the classical definition of God. Now, this is a really important point to be clear on. The Kalam argument doesn't try to prove the God of Christianity or Islam or Judaism or any specific religion. It's not about that. It simply argues that logic and evidence point toward the existence of some kind of personal, transcendent creator, a being that exists beyond time, space, and the material world. And that really leaves us with a final, pretty deep question to think about. Whether you find this whole argument convincing or not, it really makes you consider the relationship between science, philosophy, and faith. Can they work together to answer our biggest questions? It's a fascinating puzzle that sits right at the edge of human knowledge. Definitely something to chew on. Thanks for joining me for this breakdown.